This is Something to Gnaw On, and I'm your host, Nate Vainio. And this episode is a bit outside the norm. Usually I would say a short podcast for the Christian with a short attention span or just short on time. But today, I'm breaking with tradition again. Although, for you who are thoroughly conditioned for the short podcast, we've put a natural break in the middle, like I've done several times before. Interviews are not the norm, but a few weeks ago I did an interview with Danny Mullins, and the response and reviews have been excellent. On the heels of that interview, I was invited to the Cross References podcast with Luke Taylor. In a moment, you'll get to hear that interview in its entirety. He's a youth pastor, and his podcast is usually about a half-hour Bible study, and he does an excellent job digging into the application in relation to current cultural issues. Check it out on any of your podcast platforms. And a quick plug for next week, I'll have another episode of Handling Conflict King David style called Sins of the Father. And given the nature of the topic, we may ought to call this Not Handling Conflict King David style. Anyhow, I'll be looking at a popular presidential family and comparing some unique characteristics with David's dealings with his children. Now, without further ado, here's Luke Taylor's interview of me on the Cross References podcast. It's a bit of a bootleg copy. It'll air on his podcast on July 24th. But right now, here it is. Enjoy.
Welcome to the Cross References podcast. This is Luke Taylor, and I'm so glad you tuned in today. I'm not doing my normal introduction on this program because this is not a normal episode. I'm actually doing an interview today with a guy named Nate Vainio, and he lives not too far from me. You live up in Joplin, I believe, and Joplin's just about 15 minutes from where I live. But here's what was kind of interesting is I came across Nate's podcast and found out that this guy lives pretty close to me, and he does an awesome podcast called Something to Gnaw On. And I look forward to every single Friday because it's not just because it's Friday, but because I get in my car, I start driving to work, and there's a new episode of the Something to Gnaw On podcast waiting for me. And so I pop that on and listen to a good story from Nate. And so I just invited him out to have a little conversation with me today. Hey, Nate, it's nice to meet you in person.
Yeah, it's nice to put a face in the fact that you're not short. You're a good 6'5" or something like that. You know how you
a little bigger than my picture on the phone.
Yeah, you're like looking at that on a phone and going, wow, you cast all these messages back and forth and you kind of create this image in your mind. It's like, wait a minute.
Yeah. That's what you also hear working in, since I work in radio, and they always say you never look like what they expect you to look like. So
was it Garrison Keillor that always said that he had a face for radio?
Oh, yeah. They have said that. Yeah. And so I can always tell when people meet me, they're just, they never would have believed. They're always disappointed. I'm like, well, what's that all about?
Yeah.
Well, Nate, here's what I want to talk to you about today. You like stories, don't you?
Yes. Love them.
Yeah. Well, I noticed you always have a story to tell on your show. And so what is it about stories? Why do you like to use those to communicate so many truths?
Wow. You've given me a wide open canvas here. Thank you. You know, stories grab my attention. And to be able to take a story that grabs your attention, but at the same time have a biblical truth that jives with that. Mm-hmm. I refer to the podcast sometimes as a parable style podcast in the sense that we're telling a story, but it's on the one hand, it's about the story, and sometimes they're funny. Sometimes they're stories from my childhood. Sometimes they're stories about my family. And other times they're historical stories that I really like. And what's ironic is, I think the historical stories are super cool and, you know, just really intriguing and what have you. And probably the most popular stories are the ones about my childhood or, you know, recently throwing the airplane at the teacher in high school and getting nearly suspended. You know, I mean, it's, you know, those, I guess there's a relatability to that. But I had a professor in college one time that made the comment to some extent, you know, it'd be a sin to bore people with the gospel. And the thing is that I could so easily do that. I love digging in. I could spend hours digging into scripture and digging into, you know, Bible, New Testament, Old Testament, Greek, Hebrew, looking at that stuff. But the reality is sometimes you dig into that too much, you lose people along the way. Mm-hmm. And so the stories just seem to be a way to jive, to make Scripture jive and connect with people. And when you can walk away from that saying, okay, I get what Jesus is saying in this Scripture, or I get what Paul is saying here, or in the old, so that dynamic works for me on a personal level. And I really just hope that it works for people who listen in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, you always start each episode with a story.
Yep.
And I mean, you don't just start hammering someone over the head with a Bible verse or some kind of principle or life lesson. You start with the story, and I'm always like, well, okay, where's he going with this? And by the end, you've made some kind of lesson out of it, or you've connected it with some kind of truth in the Bible. And so, and here's something I was thinking about too, because you were mentioning to me that your dad's a pastor,
yeah,
and you have a son who's a pastor,
yes,
and so you've obviously spent a lot of time in your life in church, hearing a lot of sermons, hearing your dad preach, I'm sure many, many times. Is this just something that comes naturally, from that kind of background?
Yeah, from a family background, there was a dynamic of telling stories. Dad used to tell stories all the time, mm-hmm. Mom and dad both. And there's a dynamic in there of learning and understanding your heritage. And our family has some weird quirks, you go back far enough or whatever, and you start learning not just a genealogy dynamic where mm-hmm. it's okay, this person begat this person, and but it's like this person in your family did this, mm-hmm. and that's why things are the way they are today. I have a grandfather who immigrated from Finland. His parents put him on a ship when he was 6 years old and his brother was 9. If you can imagine a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old riding a ship across the Atlantic to wherever it was in Canada they landed, and so we hear stories from Grandpa, mm-hmm. So I grew up connecting my life to these stories that Mom and Dad would share and what have you. And it's given me a new appreciation. Well, I shouldn't say a new appreciation. I've always had an appreciation for my heritage. Mm-hmm. And okay, I had the appreciation for my heritage, but mm-hmm. didn't understand why I had the appreciation for my heritage. I mean, does that make sense?
Yeah.
And a few years ago, I started reading through the Old Testament and the dynamic of monuments, or depend upon which translation you're going to read, mm-hmm. They're going to talk about monuments or altars, and they're not altars for sacrificial sake or what have you. But like when the children of Israel go into the promised land, mm-hmm. they stack stones as a monument. When the tribes that settle on the east side of the Jordan River, when they cross back over, they build a monument. And the phrase that they say is that we're doing this so that when our kids ask us what this is about, mm-hmm. you'll tell them what God did in Egypt and what God did, and so there are these monuments that are set up to trigger these kind of conversations about your heritage. Mm-hmm. And anyhow, so yeah, I grew up in that. That was, Mom and Dad always sharing stories. I find myself doing the same thing with my kids, relaying stories, and it seemed like a natural fit, a natural way to do the podcast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then, so that maybe leads into the title, as you call the show Something to Gnaw On.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what it gives you. It's like a 15-minute episode. It's always, you just always somehow find a way to nail it right about 15 minutes. And you rarely go long, or you might do a double episode, but I mean, you keep it right there in that time frame. But then you leave people with something to actually think about throughout the day. And you just use the stories to do that. So, I noticed also Jesus doing something similar a lot in the Gospels, and you kind of touched on this, but that Jesus people would come to him with a question, and he would answer with a story. Yeah. And so do you see Jesus doing that a lot too?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, totally. And what's interesting, though, too, is there's a dynamic of Jesus meeting people where they are. And so you've got like Pharisees, and he doesn't sit down with Pharisees and have these conversations about, stories and parables and the prodigal son and what have you. Mm-hmm. Those conversations are a little more combative. They're a little more on the legal side, you might say, mm-hmm. discussions of the law and what have you. And I mean, it's and most of that is because the Pharisees are so combative with him. But when he's talking with somebody who's genuinely interested, or, man, that may not be the best way to put it, but somebody who's not in that Pharisaical dynamic, and he's talking to them and sharing those things. Yeah, he's laying out a story in terms that, he's not talking about stories of physics and things like that, because they can't identify with that. But there's so many agrarian or agricultural related stories and what have you. There's, the story of fishing. It's an interesting, one that he uses that's interesting, where he talks about, I shouldn't say it's a story. He says, to pay the tax, he says, hey, go, get a fish and pull the, and it's like, you can understand that. You can, in that society, you could roll with that idea, the parables, all of the parables. I don't think there's one that you could pull out of there, but yeah, it just makes things and the truth relatable. One other dynamic I was thinking about here, just since we kind of initiated this conversation a week or so ago or what have you, but if you go back to, it's really interesting to me, at least, if you go back to looking at Peter's sermon on the day of Pentecost, he makes a statement that you find in the King James Version, and it's there in the other versions, but the phrase that he uses in explaining what's going on in that moment is, this is that which the prophet Joel talked about. And so you see what he's doing is he's grabbing a hold of, you guys see this right now, and you've heard about this fact over here. This is this. This is that. And it's that dynamic of taking two things. In a story, what a story does a lot of times is it'll create a framework for you to think, or a framework for facts and figures to drop right into. It gives you something that you can hold that with. And a lot of times those stories will do that, and because you can wrap your head, you'll remember the story long after, or much longer than you would the factoid if somebody just came out and said, here are the facts. A, B, C, D, E. Yeah. So it's, anyhow. So
and it's like what you're saying. He always used things that people were familiar with, things that were new, that were real to them, and used those for the illustrations and implemented those in the story. So some good insights there. Hey, I want to ask you one more question real quick, and then we'll take a short break. But how would you introduce your podcast to somebody? Tell us about the format of your show, and why it is that you wanted to do a podcast like that.
I'm sorry. Part of why I'm laughing is that the way I describe it is that it's a short podcast for the Christian with a short attention span. It's set up with what I would refer to as a parable style podcast, in the sense that, or a parable style devotional, in the sense of what we've talked about already, that there's a story, there's biblical truth, they merge, and hopefully they have kind of a cementing dynamic to them for people who listen in. But the other dynamic that I was bent on doing with the podcast, and I breezed over it just a second ago, but it's got to be short. And I'll be honest with you, that is the exact opposite of what my tendency is. I could sit there and I could run, but we live in a culture, that may or may not have that amount of time or whatever to run long. And I'd hate to be the one who would bore people with the gospel or anything like that. But the big reason behind it, and I hope you can kind of get a kick out of this, but when I graduated from college, the first degree deal, when I graduated, they brought in a guy as the guest speaker or the commencement speaker, whatever the title would be. And he preached a sermon for like 45, 50 minutes, might have been pushing an hour. And we were seated on the floor. The graduating class was seated on the floor next to the speaker. And then everybody, the entire audience, was up in the bleachers looking down on us and what have you. And it was the most tiresome, frustrating. I felt like I was held hostage, honestly, and it was like, man, enjoy your commencement process, here. It's like, I got my diploma. I was like, man, I'm out of here. I got to go stretch my legs and I'm cramping up or what have you. Yeah. And, The next year, I come back to see my friends graduate, and a guy from, I don't know, should I say the name or whatever? I mean,
it's up to you.
I give him props. The guy's name was Del Tar. I think it was Del Tar.
Uh-huh.
Anyhow, he comes in and he says, guys, this is your day, and it's an honor to be here, something of that nature, and I'm going to speak for 13 and a half minutes. And that's what I remember it was odd. It was like, it wasn't 15 minutes. It wasn't 25 minutes or half hour. It was 13 and a half or whatever that number was. It was a very distinct number. Like he had been working on this and he just sat there and he spoke, he stood there and he spoke, and it was the most powerful sermon, speech, whatever you want to call it, that I had ever, I shouldn't say that I had ever listened to, but it was the most powerful short sermon. And in that dynamic, I just sat there and I just thought, this is crazy. So I look back on that and I think about that in terms of that and the podcast. And it's like, okay, I'm going to do all I can to make this short. And there are times where I have a really difficult time doing that, but
it's harder to be short than it is to go long, isn't it?
Oh yeah. It's easy just to kind of keep rambling. Much easier to keep rambling, and it gets really difficult when you need to start cutting stuff out, and it's like, oh, but that's good, that's a
it hurts.
It's like your baby, which limb do you cut off, okay, that's kind of dark, I realize, but
it's true.
But it spurred this spurs another part of the conversation too that I've wrestled with. Well, I shouldn't say I've wrestled with it, but I've contemplated, and don't be surprised if you don't see this as an episode at some point in time, but I've contemplated talking about what I would say are biblical shorts, short sermons, short prayers, things of that nature, and the short sermon dynamic. If you read Peter's sermon on the day of Pentecost, it's really not that long. Well, at least the initial part of it. Of course, he has he adds on a little later, but aside from the Sermon on the Mount, which is a lot of stories, there's a lot of that stuff that is short and in doses rather than drinking from a fire hydrant and what have you. So anyhow,
No, hey, my hat's off to you, because it is a lot. It's a lot harder to take a deep spiritual truth, pack it into a 15-minute lesson rather than spending an hour on it. I mean, that actually takes a lot of skill and a lot of it's a lot of hard work to cut something down. So hey, my hat's off to you. I want to take a short break right here, and then we'll come back and we'll finish up this conversation with Nate Vainio.
I hope you're enjoying this episode. We'll get back to it in a moment. One other thing I'm curious about, and I would like to take an informal survey about, is if you'd take a moment to shoot me an email with your favorite episode. It'd help me to put together a top 5 favorites list. You can shoot that information to me at somethingtonawon@gmail.com. Again, that's somethingtonawon@gmail.com. In fact, if you have any reason to send a message, maybe a question, maybe a prayer request, feel free to do so. Anyhow, I do look forward to your feedback. Maybe someday I'll do a mailbox episode responding to questions and comments. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for your support. Let's get back to the interview.
Well, hey, welcome back. So this is Luke Taylor, and you're listening to the Cross References podcast, and I'm speaking with Nate Vainio. He's the host of the Something to Gnaw On podcast, and I'm going to put links to his show and all that. Probably about anywhere you're listening to mine, you can also look up his and find his, but he's got the Something to Gnaw On podcast, and he's here with us today. He was just telling us a little bit about his show, and as I was saying, he does all his episodes in 15 minutes or less. Sometimes he'll do a double episode, and he might give you, then it's 30 minutes. You can listen to it in chunks. The one that came out today was 30 minutes. I stopped at the halfway point. I'm like, that's enough for today. Like, I want to do what the title says. I want to gnaw on it. And it was just a really good story. And I was thinking when I started my podcast, my original title for Cross References, I was going to call it 30-Minute Theology. And I was going to make it, every episode was going to be 30 minutes or less, And I am so glad I didn't do that now, because I probably on average, I go about 40 minutes, sometimes even, an hour or so. So I'm like, okay, well, I would have been lying if I had called it 30-minute theology. It is too hard. I'm not as hard of a worker as Nate. I can't get it down to a certain time. Too painful. But he does it. He's disciplined. He keeps it at 15 minutes or less each week. And so some good work there. Hey, Nate, if people were wanting to get into your show, what do you think are a good 2 or 3 episodes that you would really want to direct people to give them a good feel of what your show is all about?
I think what I'd do is I'd split my answer, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So all of the stories that I share, you generally fall into 2 categories. One is going to be stories about me, my childhood upbringing, my family, my mom and dad, that kind of stuff. The other, I love history. Mm-hmm. And so there are stories throughout history that, as I've read through some things historically, I'm thinking to myself, this is incredible, absolutely incredible. And those stories highlight something immediately in my mind. I think, hey, let's talk about these stories. And so at a minimum with those stories, I've always thought, not only do you get a good Bible study, but there's a part of our history. And a lot of those stories, I'll be honest with people, generally are World War II, Vietnam. Mm-hmm. I enjoy war history.
Well, I noticed you pull a lot of stories from that. So you read a lot of books on those subjects then?
Read a lot of that. There's one from World War I that just blew. In fact, there's a guy that does a podcast called Hardcore History. Mm-hmm. Dan Carlin, I think is his name.
I've listened to that one.
And that's what got me started listening to years ago, listening to podcasts related to history and what have you. Now, I did the exact opposite of Dan Carlin, because you listen to Dan Carlin's deal, he's got a 6-hour podcast. So it's like,
true.
We are diametrically opposed to each other in that. But he shared a story related to the start of World War I that just blew my mind, and I dug into it. I kind of hit stop, and I was like, I just got to go back to the original and dig that up myself. And so anyhow, a lot of those. So you have those 2 dynamics of personal stories versus historical stories, war stories, dynamics. There is one episode that I do historically that is actually Josephus. It goes back to which it blew my mind when I read it. And if people are listening and they don't know who Josephus is, Josephus was most often people think of him as a historian, but he was also from a royal family, a Jewish family, priestly family. He was a general. He was an architect, and he was captured by the Romans. And what we read as history during early biblical days was written by this guy. Mm-hmm. And so he tells his story in this, and there's one episode where I kind of walk through the story of his capture, and it's absolutely amazing to me. Sometimes, have you been in, and you've probably done this, I mean, you've been in ministry for a few years, we do word studies. Mm-hmm. We go back to the Greek, we go back to the Hebrew or what have you. And understanding the language is a good thing. But in that episode in particular, what I do is I look at how Josephus uses the word repent, and how he uses the word repent just unlocks the understanding of the biblical usage of the term in the same era. And so that's one that, if people are interested in historical dynamics, the title of that episode is The Idiot's Guide to Roman Citizenship.
Okay.
That's that one there.
I see that here, your January 13th episode.
Yeah. Then another one that is on the history side that I would recommend is called My TED Talk, which is a story about Ted Roosevelt, the eldest son of President Teddy Roosevelt, which is another. In fact, can I dive into another little story? Go for it. Another dynamic that, as I've been working through this on the early end, was reading their story. And Ted Roosevelt writes in his memoir, shares the letters that his dad shared with him. And he talks about his dad and the relationship that they had, but we were talking about sharing family stories and your heritage. And he writes in his book that his dad would have him walk to the Department of the Navy or the war, wherever it was in Washington that he was working. He would have him walk, and he uses this interesting phrase, is that his dad would share the history of the area. He would share the monuments, the statues and the grounds and the buildings. And his phrase was, he would share the history, not the dates and charters, the boring things of history, but he would tell it in a way in which you thought you were there. And I was like, I read that way back, and I was like, that's incredible, because you look at that dynamic between their relationship, and then you see what Ted Roosevelt does. And you might have to listen to the episode, My TED Talk, but he ends up receiving the Medal of Honor as his acts of heroism at Normandy. And not just a single act. It was a day's worth of, I'm sorry, I'm getting into these stories. It's like, man, I got to tell these, the gist of it that'll just blow your mind is that this is a guy who lied as an officer, didn't tell the army that he had a bad heart and that he had a bad knee. And so he goes into I think it's Utah Beach. He goes in on the first wave because there were no other senior officers to go in. And he saw that as a huge problem. He's like, I got to go. And so he makes it happen to where he goes. But he's on the beach with a Colt 1911 in his hand and a cane in the other because he can't walk.
Wow. The
entire day, stuff blowing up left and right and whatever, and people talked about how he was just calm as a cucumber just that whole time. And so anyway, I come back to the relationship he had with his dad and his dad telling those stories, creating that framework for him to work through life. And it's powerful. Stories are powerful.
Yeah. Well, hey, I'm like, okay, you're talking here. I'm pulling those up, and they're downloading on my phone right now. So.
I would say too that just a couple of episodes. The irony of this is that I love that history, but the most popular episodes are the ones where I'm telling stories about me being a knucklehead as a kid or something like that. So the episode "Death to Pepe" is I come in contact with a skunk and I survived the day.
Was that more recent? It seems familiar.
No, that was actually like the second or third one.
Oh, okay.
It goes all the way back.
Okay. I see it here. November 4th of last year.
Yeah. So it's that is one. Another one is The Ripple Effect, which tells a story of a friend of mine and I who took a 6-foot Livingston boat out on the Puget Sound, and that almost ended not too well. And then there's one here that I've always loved this. I've always loved the title, and I won't say much about it, but I think the title says plenty, but it's called The Shoestring Snot Revival. And it's a bit of a story about a time in which God got a hold of me. I gave my life to the Lord as a kid in third grade, and there were days or there were years in there where I had drifted, and there was a time in my high school years where God got a hold of me, and that's what that story's about. And so it's that's if you want to know how I ended up getting myself turned around, it had nothing to do with me. That'll tell you exactly how God did it.
Okay. Well, yeah, that's a good starter pack for people if they want to jump into your podcast, and you put new episodes out each Friday. I was looking here as I was scrolling through my phone. I guess I've been listening since February. I didn't even realize it had been that long, but
cool.
Yeah, my first one that I listened to, I think it was Father Abraham Had 7 Smurfs is the name. And maybe it was part of the title. I was like, okay, I got to see what that's all about. Yeah. And you had some thoughts on worship in that episode, and it was really thought-provoking. So which I guess that's the title, something to gnaw on. So that's the point. But some really good stuff there. So if people want to go check it out, that's the name of the podcast, is Something to Gnaw On. And there's several episodes that, like you said, it could make a good starter pack. One thing you've been doing differently is a series of episodes on King David.
Yeah.
And what was it that drew you to focus on that?
I honestly don't remember. I really, sometimes the Bible's like a rabbit hole, man. You just kind of get started on something, and what ended up happening in that was I was just reading one day, and I would try to compare and reconcile an episode in Samuel versus an episode in Kings, the record of the same episode, kind of like the same way we handle looking at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and there's, you have looking at the same deal. And as I got to looking at that in the life of David, for whatever reason, I started seeing the dynamic of the conflicts, not just, the easy ones in David's life are, Saul, that's an easy one, but there's a lot of other stuff, and it just became a rabbit hole of, man, this thing just keeps going. But I wanted to do it in such a way that, I love expository preaching, expository study. This is not that. This is looking at David's relationships with certain individuals in the story and following it from start to finish. And so we look at Joab, we look at Saul, we look at this last week we're looking at Michael, and these are individuals that they pop up on the radar a couple of times. They may not always be there, but then now we're getting to the end of this, and it's like, okay, we've got 4 or 5 individuals that we can start to kind of weave. We've looked at Saul, and we've looked at Jonathan, and we've looked at Joab, and of course in that episode Abner and Abishai, and those guys show up, and then and you start. We're kind of getting to that place in the study where we merge and weave those together. But for the time being, it's like pulling that relationship out of that, and let's say, okay, let's just get to understand this relationship before we put it back into its context. And looking at, and I don't remember exactly why. I wish I had a super profound response, for that. But the dynamic of looking at how David handled conflict, because the irony is most times people look at that and they think, well, David didn't handle conflict real well. And the subtitle to that is handling conflict King David style, or not handling conflict King David style. So there's all sorts of opportunities in his life. His life's under a microscope, covered in so many books. And I just wanted to do more of a character study than a expository verse by verse dynamic, or what have you, and then just kind of go back and weave those together. So I'm not even sure when or where this will end.
Just following it until
we're just
like wringing out a sponge. You're just getting everything you can out of it.
You bet.
Yeah. Well, one thing I've noticed through the series is you talk about, and I'm going to use a word that I hate to use about people in the Bible, but you talk about the characters in the stories. You're talking about them though as real people, because they were real people. I think we kind of forget that sometimes, and we think of them like story characters. But you're actually spending a lot of time thinking about their personalities and trying to get inside their heads. Yeah.
This last one with looking at Michael, there's a dynamic in that of almost doing a psychological profile, which I am thoroughly undereducated for. But part of that is, being able to step back, and, part of understanding Michael is understanding Saul, and well, what would it be like to be this maniacal king's daughter, his son, and so, what would it, and again, it's back to that story dynamic. Put yourself in the, like Ted Roosevelt was talking about his dad saying, hey, tell this in such a way that you put yourself into that.
Yeah.
How is it that we can talk about that story with David, any one of them, and interject ourselves into that to where we can see rather than just reading a book and checking it off for the teacher, and so we get our grade and our participation award for the day. But how is it we get into that? And that's the challenge.
No, but I mean that it's very rewarding whenever you put in the work, because then when you tell that story, you're really bringing it to life. Yeah. And people read these stories, maybe they've read them 100 times, but if you don't really stop and just kind of walk through it slow, like you've been doing, there's so much more you can bring out of it. And I mean, it really makes you realize that these were real people dealing with real things. They had real emotions. Yeah. And so I appreciate you doing that. Again, the podcast that Nate does, it's called Something to Gnaw On. And people probably got that by now. But Nate, when you tell people how to find it, is it just anywhere people get their podcasts? Yeah,
I would say it's on most. I'm guessing there are a few that it may not be on there, but it'll be on all of your major podcast platforms. You can catch meet up on Facebook at Something to Gnaw on Facebook. Just type that in. It'll take you to the Facebook page. Mm-hmm. There's also a dedicated website for that you can listen to that and just bypass for those who may not be podcast. Of course, this is your podcast, so they probably listen to that. But if there's that's one of the things that I've dealt with on the front end of this was I had so many people who had no knowledge of how to track down a podcast dynamic. So the website is up. If you wanted to refer this, maybe that's the way to look at this. If you wanted to send it to somebody, the website is somethingtognawon.com. Okay. And all of the episodes load right from that website. And so if you send that to somebody who's not podcast savvy or what have you, they can listen to them right from the website.
Yeah, no, that's a good way to do it, because I also put my episodes up on YouTube, and so some people, if they don't use a podcast app, then they can go use the website. They can check that out. Somethingtognawon.com. Yep. Is that what you said?
You bet.
Okay. Well, that's where people can go. And so, hey, I just feel kind of inspired to really, as I'm going through the Bible, to kind of slow myself down a little more and just think about the personalities of the people in the story. And remember that they aren't just characters, even though we use that word a lot, but they were real people. And so I feel more inspired to do that today. And Something to Gnaw On podcast has helped me with that too. So, hey, Nate, thanks for coming along and sharing some of these insights with us. And I hope people will go and check out your show next.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation. A quick plug again for next week. I'll have another episode of I guess we're going to call it the not handling conflict King David style this time. It's called Sins of the Father. I'll be looking at a popular presidential family and comparing some of the unique characteristics with David's dealings with his children. Until next week, God bless.